Good afternoon. I'm Donald Mastronarde, the chair of the Learning and Retirement Lecture Committee, and I'm very pleased to welcome you, as Camille did, to the first series of our spring semester. In this series, we feature three outstanding scholars of the campus who will consider various aspects of the crisis brought on by the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago and the continuing conflict, ranging from matters that pertain specifically to Ukraine to a broader historical view of the European land empires that have been the ambition of Germany and Russia. Today's speaker is Yuriy Gorodnichenko, the Quantedge Presidential Professor in the Department of Economics. He received his BA and MA in economics from the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and then attended the University of Michigan, where he earned an MA in statistics and a PhD in economics. At completion of his PhD at Michigan, he came directly to Berkeley as an assistant professor in 2007 and has risen to his current professorship. Professor Gorodnichenko specializes in data-driven research on macroeconomic trends and policies. He has long been an expert on the Ukrainian economy and has published books and articles in Ukrainian on this subject early in his career. In his many dozens of articles and chapters in English, he has analyzed how policies and expectations affect the behavior and spending of individuals and corporations, and tested how the results match up against the intentions of a policy or the expectations of people. The subject of inflation is prominent in his studies, which have looked at the instances in Ukraine and other European examples, as well as the US. He is an energetic participant in university and public service, and he serves in many distinguished editorial and advisory roles. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to speak to us on war economy in Ukraine. Yuriy, go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. Me share my slides that I prepared for this talk. In this talk, I will try to cover the current situation and also give you an outlook for what can happen in Ukraine after the war is over. And just to make everybody is up to speed, let me say that tomorrow is going to be a 700th day of the war. 700 days of war. It's a lot. And just, today, Russians attacked again many large Ukrainian cities. This is one of them, Kharkiv. I see lots of rubble, fires, destruction. And sort of tragically, the Russian media covers this as if, Ukrainian armed forces are hiding in these buildings and somehow the Russians attack military targets. Anyway, this is just another kind of scenario you want to keep in mind when you think about what happens in Ukraine. Now, again, just to make sure everybody is up to speed, what we see in Ukraine is the level of destruction that Europe has not experienced since World War II. This is Bucha, a small suburb of Kyiv. Huge destruction, lots of dead people, lots of killings. And unfortunately, what you see in this little suburb, this is not an isolated incident. You read, for example, United Nations Human Rights report on what is happening in Ukraine, and you can't escape thinking that this is an official government policy of Russia. This Bucha scene is happening everywhere. Now, people, I think, think Ukraine is a small country. At least they used to think it's a small country, but it is a very big country. It's roughly the size of Texas. And this map here shows how much of the country was affected by the war. So this pink stuff, this is still what is controlled by Russians. The blue stuff is the territories that are liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces. You look at this and you say, well, maybe only a slice of Ukraine was affected directly by, fighting. But this is a big, country. And so even a share of this country is going to be a lot of territory, lots and lots of people, millions and millions of people. Just to give you again a sense of how much war affects Ukraine, if you take the territory that Russians occupied as of summer 2022 and superimposes basically any European country, for example, Italy here, you will see that basically the north of Italy is going to be totally under Russian occupation. If you do the same exercise with California, basically San Francisco and up north all of that land is going to be occupied by Russians. So you're talking about lots and lots of people, lots and lots of cities, villages, lots of homes are destroyed. Now, you can't really have words to describe the suffering of people directly affected by the war, but the economic numbers are very clear about the scale of destruction and the scale of losses. For example, GDP, gross domestic product, that's a popular metric for economic activity. It declined in 2022 by 30%, right? So to give you a sense of what it is, think about the Great Depression that compressed in 1 year, okay? So it's massive loss. Now, 9 million people left the country. They are refugees in European countries, in Canada, some people are in the US. And despite the fact that so many people left the country, the rate of unemployment in 2022 was roughly 30%, 35%. We don't have very precise estimates. So you can kind of picture the level of destruction and economic collapse with these numbers. It's really, really difficult. It's even hard to imagine what it is, but it's just a huge, massive shock. And this shock is so big that you can literally see it from space. This figure here shows the nightlight intensity for Ukraine in 2022 when Russians attacked the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And you see this land is completely black, right? And Ukraine is not North Korea. It's actually a very developed country, at least in terms of energy sector. And seeing this big country completely dark, this is really, really unusual. Now, many of us, whoever lived in California knows that we can have blackouts and they may be inconvenient. And you have 1 day without electricity, you can kind of do okay. On the second day, you run out of your batteries and you start to face serious problems. On day 3 or 4, you go to Stone Age, right? So now in some places in Ukraine, you will have no electricity for weeks. And it will be very cold time. This is happening in the winter. So you can imagine the level of hardship many people in Ukraine are going to face in this very difficult times. Now, it's not just that you don't have electricity, it's also unpredictability of this, blackouts. You take an elevator and, sometimes you don't know if you're going to make it to your floor. You may get stuck and spend a night, a couple of days in that elevator. These stories have happened. So just to give you a scale of, what is happening there. Here's another figure which I think is useful for understanding where the damage is done and how disruptive these Russian attacks are. This figure on the left shows where energy infrastructure was affected the most. You see these red regions? This is close to the front lines. Maybe it's not surprising, but a lot of damages were done in Western Ukraine, presumably safe regions. There is another kind of way to see this. It's hard to get official statistic on how much damage was done. But one statistic you can do is to look at the number of hours or percent of hours that ATMs spend without electricity. This is collected by private banks and they publish the statistics sometimes. And you can see, for example, here in Kyiv, 20% of the time you didn't have electricity. Imagine like 20% of your day you have no electricity. Every day for many, many months. It is very difficult to operate in these conditions. And, maybe not surprisingly, when you look at other metrics of economic performance, you see very clearly a big contraction of economic activity. For example, steel industry is one of the bigger industries in Ukraine. You start here, this is pre-war, you have 80% collapse in the production of steel, okay, immediately in the beginning of the war. Part of this is because the Russians directly destroyed the production facilities. There was a giant steel mill, 2 giant steel mills in Mariupol, they completely destroyed. So it's kind of one reason why it's not happening. Another reason why it's not happening is that Ukraine used to export a lot of this steel, but it cannot export anymore this product. And so, if you can't export, you can't really produce the stuff because you have no place to store. On the top of this, you have all this, daily attacks on various production facilities, and not surprisingly, then production is going to be very, very stagnant. This is freight transportation, similar story, massive collapse again, because you have nothing to transport. They used to transport steel. Steel is not there anymore. So what do? You have a contraction of economic activity. And you can look at many, many other indicators, and it's going to portray a similar story that the first days of the war was an enormous shock. Some industries almost completely collapsed. Some industries are still there. Some industries proven to be much more resilient. And, there is some useful lessons in that. To give you sort of a rule of thumb estimate how much this war costs Ukraine, every day of the war is costing roughly anywhere between $1 and $1.5 billion. So if it's 700 days of the war, you multiply this per day cost, and you're going to see really big numbers. We're approaching $1 trillion there. And it's not just, damaged infrastructure, it's also lost human capital, lost revenue and everything. So it's a big loss, and it's accumulating every day. Now, in terms of broader economic outlook, when you see this kind of challenges, you try to identify what you can do and where you have critical vulnerabilities. And in Ukraine, the two critical issues are basically two imbalances. One is the fiscal imbalance, the difference between government revenues and government spending. That's on the left axis. And the other one is your external balance or imbalance. That's the difference between your exports and imports. Ideally, these two statistics should be relatively close to zero. And Ukraine used to have roughly balanced budgets, and it had a roughly balanced trade. But now we see these huge deficits, huge deficits. For example, you see massive increase in government spending. Why is that? Well, it's because Ukraine has to spend a lot of money on defense. Just again, to give you a sense, before the war started, this full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukraine was spending roughly 4% of GDP on defense. And this was a high number relative to many other European countries because Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and this is the first round of Russian aggression. Everybody in Ukraine realized that the war is coming and we have to be prepared. We have to build these capabilities to defend ourselves. But nobody expected it's going to be this big. So 30% of GDP spent on defense. We're talking about the levels we have seen in World War II, right? In those years, US would spend, anywhere between 30 and 50% of GDP on the war effort. So it's a massive level of spending. Now, what is also bad about this is that instead of obviously not spending this money, government money on healthcare, on education, many other important things, you have to spend this on defense. But what is also bad about the spending is that it's very hard to control it. If your general comes to you and says, look, I need to buy a tank or pay salaries to my soldiers, you can't really say no to that. You have to pay for that. And this is a big challenge because then you can't really control your spending. You're going to have what is called fiscal dominance, which is dictated by the needs of the war. Now, the second one here is imbalances in trade. And we can see that now Ukraine is running a huge deficit, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion per month. Here, fiscal deficits are roughly similar, also like $3-4 billion per month. Okay. Now, how do you close these imbalances? There is, a range of possibilities here, but in the end, Ukraine is relying a lot on economic aid to keep the economy and government functioning and also close this external imbalance. This chart here shows the time series of economic aid that Ukraine received by months. Okay. Now, this dark green bars is what is given in Ukraine as a loan. And this tends to be aid coming from European countries, from Canada, from Japan, from some other places. These light green areas are grants. So basically, it's money given to Ukraine, and there is no expectation that Ukraine will have to repay them. These light green areas are mostly coming from the United States. And you can see that in the first year of the war, the United States was the main economic supporter of Ukraine. For example, in August 2022, on the Independence Day of Ukraine, the US government gave Ukraine $3 billion of economic aid. That was a very nice birthday present. But then if you look forward and see what was happening in 2023, you first notice that there is a lot of variation in the flow of aid. That's not good. It makes economic support unpredictable, and I'll come back to this later. And you can also see that the amount of economic aid flowing from the United States is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And in January 2023, it's going to be exactly zero. Okay, so that's not good. It creates a lot of unpredictability. It creates a lot of vulnerabilities here, right? So you will not be able to function as a government if you can't close this gap. You can't function as an economy because you have to pay for your imports. And just to be clear, here you see the trade was balanced. The light green line and red line were roughly equal to each other, which means Ukraine was importing roughly the amount that it was exporting. Here we see this big gap. Exports stay depressed. Imports are very high. Why is that? Part of this is coming from the fact that Ukraine has to import lots and lots of commodities to allow the economy to function. So, for example, think about gasoline. Ukraine used to produce gasoline internally. We had oil refineries, a big sector there. All major oil refineries in Ukraine are destroyed by Russian missiles. Now, if you want to have a functioning economy, you have to import gasoline, diesel, kerosene, all sorts of fuel to keep the economy going. And again, you can't really control this. You just have to pay whatever is the market price, and your neighbors hopefully can support you with this. This is why imports are so high, partially. So the question is, how can you continue functioning if you don't have this sense? We know from the early months of the war, when economic aid was relatively small, how the government was solving this. And it was not a good solution. Basically, the government was forced to print money. And if you print money, this is going to create inflation. This is going to create inflation. And we know inflation is extremely destructive, not only for the social fabric of the country, but for any country, but also for economic activity. Now, once economic aid stabilized, the Ukrainian authorities could, implement a set of policies, specifically a tight monetary policy, to control inflation. And now the rate of inflation is, roughly 5%. And ironically, the rate of inflation in Ukraine is now lower than the rate of inflation in Russia. And to be clear again, all the war is happening in Ukraine. Ukraine has lost a big chunk of its territory, a lot of its productive capacity is destroyed, and somehow Ukraine manages to have a lower rate of inflation than Russia. That's really remarkable. Now, what's next? Okay, external imbalance. The main challenge here is that Ukraine cannot physically export its main products. It cannot export steel, it cannot export grain. This is a big challenge. This is the map of south of Ukraine, Black Sea shore. No, this is Crimea. Ukraine does not control these ports anymore. This is Odessa and a few other big ports here. They were under Russian blockade for many months, and so they couldn't really operate. These black anchors here are also ports which are either directly controlled by the Russians or blocked by the Russians. And you have only a handful of ports here close to the Danube River that were still functioning. I'll come back to these ports and their importance going forward. Now, if you can't export, obviously, this is going to be a big problem. You're going to have massive declines in, for example, production of grain and also exports of grain. And this is going to be one reason why Ukraine has this giant imbalance here. It would like to increase its exports, move this light green line up, but it can't because it's physically constrained. Ships can go to this seaports. Now, what has been the solution to this problem? The most recent solution to this problem is basically ignore Russia, try to keep Russian Navy from Ukrainian ports, and then rely on territorial waters of few countries in the Black Sea and use their roughly protection to ship grain from Odessa to Istanbul and beyond. And to give you a sense of how important it has become, this figure here on the left shows the volume of exports that are being processed by Ukrainian seaports. You see, it went all the way to zero, so nothing was happening. Then there was a deal between the United Nations, Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine that Russian Navy will allow Ukrainian ships to transport grain from Odessa to the rest of the world. Then they left this deal. You see, everything that was going here kind of disappears. And now Ukraine found a new route, which is now protected by effectively Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And the volume of exports is going to be roughly at the level that we had when we had the deal with the Russians. Okay, so here we see kind of a combination of military capabilities and also creativity to find new routes to kind of bypass Russian blockade. And this is sort of a general message. Ukraine has been extremely creative in kind of overcoming obstacles and finding new solutions. And just to give you a sense of how much creativity is happening there, this figure on the left shows new business registrations. Okay, so this is kind of personal entrepreneurs. This are firms, this darker green line. And you see, when the war started, this whole registration business collapsed. Nobody was doing anything. But then you see this gradual increase in the number of new businesses and new entrepreneurs. This red line is when Russia started to attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure in 2022. So again, it was a negative shock. When you look at these numbers here, how many new registration Ukraine has, it's basically at the level we had before the war. So it's as if, the economy, these private businesses are recovered to the level we had before the war. This is the number of tickets sold by the national railway company. It's passenger traffic. Again, massive collapse. Nobody is going anywhere when the war started. And then we have gradual recovery. This is when outages started, when you didn't have electricity. Again, a big dent here in the volume of traffic. But then eventually traffic recovers and we're roughly at the level we had before the war. It's truly amazing that something like this can happen when you have, so much damage done to the economy. And yet somehow people find resilience and open new businesses and continue functioning to the best of their ability. It's really remarkable. Now, one thing I also wanted to say is that Ukraine is not uniformly affected by the war. For example, here this figure is showing the number of restaurants that are open relative to the number of restaurants that were open before the war started. And you can see, for example, here, this is Donetsk. Only 10% of restaurants are still open. And this is as of 2022. I think it's lower now. You see here some big numbers, 88%, 85%, but lots of places are not doing very well. Odessa, for example, is only 2/3. Kiev is roughly 2/3, 70%. So there is, massive shock, and it's not uniformly distributed. You can also see this in this chart, which is showing the time series of economic activity by sector: industry, trade, construction, services. Construction is basically dead for a long time in the beginning of the war here. But then you have a massive recovery because you have to rebuild so many things in the country. Other sectors were less affected. For example, trade had a contraction, but it wasn't as bad as some other sectors. Now, what do you do when you have this huge, inequality, if you will, across sectors and places? Well, in a nutshell, you have two strategies. One is to rely on government intervention. Basically, government is saying, let's move resources from this sector to this sector, or let's relocate people from Donetsk to a certain place. That's one option. Another option is to rely on market-based mechanisms, basically offer people incentives to move from one place to another, or try to find a job in industry A instead of industry B. Early in the war, Ukraine experimented with the government intervention. For example, it started to regulate prices on various goods. And then almost immediately, the country was next to being paralyzed because we had shortages of gasoline and fuel more generally. Then after that, in May of 2022, they decided to liberalize this market and say, whatever market wants, we will accept this, and we'll try market-based mechanism to ensure that there is a stable, robust supply of fuel in the country. And so the general philosophy was that you have to work through the market economy to stimulate people to put their resources in the best possible uses in the country. And this is somewhat unusual because typically you think of wartime economy as a situation where the government controls everything. And it's true in Ukraine, the government controls many aspects of economic activity, but it's not as invasive as one would imagine should happen in Ukraine. So this is sort of a big difference relative to what we have seen in other places. Now, despite all the resilience and some recovery, the economic outlook remains extremely uncertain. For example, this figure here on the left shows the predictions of inflation from the National Bank of Ukraine. So think about this as the Federal Reserve System. And you see that, they predict inflation will increase some and then fall to roughly 5%. And the shaded regions show the degree of uncertainty. This darker regions say, this is a likely scenario. Lighter dark, this lighter green, this is less likely. Very light green, this is even less likely. Anyhow, so when you look at the range of possibilities here, for example, for inflation, you can have anywhere between 0 and 20% in a year or two. The same is true for GDP. You can have, some growth on average. They predict that the economy is going to recover by roughly 5, maybe 6%. But there is enormous uncertainty in this prediction. You can have very fast growth, but you can have another economic collapse, with roughly equal probabilities. And, if you're a businessman or if you want to do any kind of economic activity, it's really hard to operate in this kind of environment because your planning horizon is not in years or decades. It's really matters of weeks, months, it's very short horizons. This is not very good for economic activity. You can't do any kind of meaningful investment in these conditions. Now, one thing I also wanted to say is that part of the reason why we have so much uncertainty is because there is so much uncertainty about how much economic aid Ukraine is going to receive. This data here is from the Kiel Institute for World Economy. They have a team of economists who track various governments and international financial institutions that support Ukraine over the years and specifically during the war. And here you can see how much aid was committed to different by different agencies over time. So you see like a big spike here. This is what funded Ukraine basically for 2023. Then we have, some action here. This is a promise from the European Union to give Ukraine 48 billion euros over the next 5 years. It's still not approved because Hungary is blocking this aid. And there is some uncertainty about whether this is going to happen or not, or what will be the amount of that. Well, I also told you that the US government is not giving Ukraine any money at this point. And just to be clear, this economic aid is not used for defense at all. Every dollar that is given in economic aid to Ukraine is spent on schools, healthcare, pensions, basically the social spending that you have in any government. All defense spending is paid by Ukrainian taxes. All defense spending is paid by Ukrainian taxes. And so if this economic aid is not going to arrive, you have to, as the Ukrainian government, have to make a very difficult choice. Do you continue to pay, doctor's salary, or you pay your soldier salary? That's the choice you will have to make at that point. And, this uncertainty is not good for anybody. Now, having said this, I often get the question, will the war continue if the economic or military aid stops to Ukraine? And as of December 2023, the vast majority of Ukrainians refused to accept any territorial concessions to Russia to have any kind of deal. And in part, it's based on the experience that people had when they lived under Russian occupation. In part, this is because they don't think the Russian government is trustworthy. And in part, it's because, mainly, I think it's because Ukrainians think they can defeat the Russian aggression. And so having this morale is very important. But if you see something like this, it's obviously not good for morale. Now, to summarize what we have here in terms of current economic situation, obviously we hope the war is going to be over soon, but I don't think it's very likely. I think it will go on for quite some time. And so in these conditions, we have to have very clear policies that are going to support war effort over a long period of time. For example, here I have one point about prudence and caution in public finances. For example, this in practical terms can mean that you should not be indexing pensions to inflation, okay, because you just don't have money for it. A durable nominal anchor. This means basically control inflation. If inflation gets out of hand, you destroy the economy, you will not be able to support war effort. Resilient financial system, right? So this is the blood system for any economy. Ukrainian banks are under constant cyber attacks from Russia. Like every single day, there is a massive attack. Somehow these banks resist this. They're extremely resilient. It's amazing that the financial system is still functioning and hopefully will continue to function. We want to protect banks from any kind of collapse. And again, just to give you a perspective, we know in 2008, when there was the Great Recession, the banking system, the financial system in the US had a meltdown, GDP contracted by something like 8%. Now, if you have a war on the top of this, you can safely multiply this by a factor of 10, and you're going to get kind of a sense of economic calamity of what can happen if the banking system is not working. Careful management of external balances. So remember, Ukraine relies a lot on imports of energy, military equipment, and so on from the rest of the world. You have to pay for it with hard currency. And Ukraine has very little of that because it cannot export. So you have to be very careful in how you spend this money. And finally, you have scarce resources. 9 million people left the country. You have so much destruction. 8% of housing stock is completely destroyed. 8%. We're talking about millions of homes, millions of people. You have to manage this resource and how extract the maximum we can have. And one possibility is to have government intervention, as I mentioned, but another one is to try to rely on market-based forces. Also use tech to allocate resources, create all sorts of matching between who has housing and who doesn't have housing. Maybe we can have Airbnb kind of in Ukraine to help internally displaced people. I also want to say that what happens in Ukraine is clearly not just the Ukrainian problem. It's really a threat to global security. And it sounds kind of funny, but given economic and military aid to Ukraine is really the best investment in peace. And obviously, it's not just Ukraine that is responsible for this. It has to be an international coalition. Now, this is the current situation. Let me say a few words about what will happen or likely can happen in Ukraine after the war is over. And in this presentation, I will rely on a book that I co-edited with Ilona Sologub and Beatrice Weather-Dimaur. It's a relatively big book, about 450 pages, which we wrote in 2022, in the end of 2022. And this was sort of a follow-up of the report we wrote in March of 2022. Now, in March of 2022, remember, everybody was saying Ukraine is going to fall in 2 or 3 days. And so when we were writing about the reconstruction of Ukraine at that time, this was a sort of a science fiction. People thought we were crazy. But now it's clear Ukraine is going to be around, and there will be some peace eventually, and we'll have to think about how we can rebuild the country after so much damage. And so we recruited, world-known experts, government officials, former government officials, famous academics, to help us write that report, this Rebuilding Ukraine Principles and Policies. And roughly it has 14 chapters, which you can put in 4 buckets. One is about infrastructure. How do you rebuild bridges? How do you rebuild schools? This kind of sense. Then it's all about, then you have another bucket about institutions, because ultimately we want to have not just hardware infrastructure, but also software, which is right for rebuilding the country. And it's also going to be a set of chapters on human capital, because ultimately, if we want to have a sustainable recovery, it has to be centered on people. It has to be centered on human capital. And finally, we have a few chapters on the business environment, because ultimately, this is going to be the glue that is going to keep everything together. I don't have time to go over every chapter, but I want to give you a gist of what we say in this book, and hopefully make you also think about what can be done in Ukraine and for Ukraine. Here, I'll give you a list of principles that we think a successful reconstruction should follow. Aid should be rapid but conditional, right? So we need money now, but obviously we have to have oversight of how this money is spent. We need grants rather than loans because the country is devastated by the war. It will not be able to repay debts. Coordination, administration, ownership, integration, and modernization. Let me give you sort of a quick illustration for why each of these principles is going to be important. I'll just do this for a few principles. One is about coordination. We have, unfortunately, many recent examples when international aid was not very effective. Afghanistan is one of these examples. This is the ring road, the strategic road which goes around Afghanistan. It was a big deal, a big infrastructure project. This work was split between different players: US, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Japan, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Now, obviously, security concerns were never fully addressed in Afghanistan, but in a nutshell, this road was never completed, in part because there was very poor coordination between all these different players. They couldn't agree on timing, on schedule, on standards. It took a long time, and this road was never completed. So coordination is going to be extremely important. We have so many people, so many countries, so many institutions willing to help Ukraine. They have to be talking to each other. There has to be a meeting place where somebody is going to look at what is needed and what is available in terms of resources. Administration. So here we advocate that this reconstruction agency has to be run by some type of European agency that is going to have a separate budget, multi-year budget, and it's going to have committed staff. This is just to make sure there is no mission drift and there is clear responsibility. Again, just as a point of reference, this is the organizational chart of the Marshall Plan, when the US gave a lot of aid to Europe after World War II. It's very clear who is running the show, right? You have administrator, and it's a very vertical structure. It's almost like an army structure. And maybe it's not surprising because Mr. Marshall designed this agency. This is reconstruction of Afghanistan. Can you tell who is in charge here? I couldn't figure out, and I'm not alone in this. So it's very hard to see who is responsible for what. So administration like this is going to be important. Ukraine must own reconstruction. The main message here is that if I want to rebuild a bridge in Bucha or Mariupol or somewhere else, we have to rebuild it there because the local community needs it. At some point, aid is going to be withdrawn, and these local communities are going to be responsible for what is built there. So they will have to maintain a school, a bridge, or whatever is built there. If they don't value that, it's going to be a waste of money for everybody. And this waste can be really, really large. This is another example from Afghanistan. It's a beautiful plant, designed here and built here to produce electricity for Kabul. It cost a lot of money, roughly $1/3 of a billion. This is how much electricity it produced. See this tiny blip here? This is the amount of electricity. Why is that? Because at some point, somebody realized that it's not very safe to transport diesel to this place. And so this is not going to be cost effective. So they just shut it down. And it was total waste. Why? Because nobody cared to consult the locals about the effectiveness of this plan and how much it can cost. Here is another principle: modernization. When we think about rebuilding Ukraine, it shouldn't be about restoring Ukraine to the state it was just before the war. There are many problems in Ukraine before the war. We should not go back to that status quo. Here is one example of these problems. This is a part of Kharkiv, the second largest city. This is one particular district of this place, which has 600,000 residents before the war. This is how this place looks now. Okay. Now, this is Soviet infrastructure, which means it's not particularly, nice. It's not livable. It's extremely energy inefficient. And so when we ask ourselves, should we go from here back to the glory of this, Soviet infrastructure and architecture? The answer is probably no. We have to build something better. We have to build more energy efficient buildings, for example. And this is going to kill two birds with one stone. It's going to save energy, save planet, and also reduce the reliance of Ukraine on any kind of energy that it may import from Russia in the future. Anyhow, so we have some principles here. And what I want to do next is to give you a summary of what we think about reconstruction specifically, and what are the main takeaways here. One takeaway is that obviously, if you want to reduce the cost of reconstruction, you have to minimize damages during the war. And for example, here you have a power substation which is destroyed by Russian missiles. This is a concrete example that is very costly to rebuild, and it's going to have a lot of damage for the rest of the economy. But it's not just about physical infrastructure. Think about children who are living in Ukraine now. You have year and a half of COVID, that's not good education. Then you have 2 years of war, that's not good education. And why they can't have good education? Because every time there is an air raid, people have to go to shelters. If you don't have a shelter, it means you have no school at all. So everything is going to be in Zoom. Now, you can resolve this by building better bomb shelters in schools and hospitals and other places. It's going to cost money, but it is doable. And if you do this, you're going to save some money in the future. So it's the first message. The second message is about the institutional infrastructure. We already see that during the war, there are all sorts of delays in giving aid, military and economic, to Ukraine, right? So for example, here you look at what was committed, this light blue, what was dispersed to Ukraine in 2022. There is a giant gap here. It's billions of dollars. The European Union in 2022 was terrible. It promised to give $9 billion. It gave maybe 5. Why? Because, all sorts of bureaucratic delays and everything. Now, this is happening in the heat of the war when your needs are extreme, right? You can't go to your soldiers and say, sorry, we don't have money to buy you a tank or ammunition, right? You just have to die there. You can't, this is not really working. Now, imagine if you don't have the heat of the war, then all of these, commitments are going to be even harder to maintain. You always have some reasons to say, well, we don't really need to do this or that because we have other priorities. And so this means we have to be thinking about new institutions and new instruments that are going to deliver this aid effectively and timely. Another thing I want to mention is that you look at the cost of the war, and it is going to be astronomical. The World Bank report last year, I think it was February 2023, estimated the cost at $400 billion. I think by now it's very safe to say it's at least $700 billion, if not $1 trillion. It's clear that no public money is going to be enough for this. And frankly, we don't need this because ultimately the long-term success of Ukraine is going to be a function of whether Ukraine can integrate its economy in global value chains. And that is not going to be done with government money. Government money can help you to build infrastructure, but you need to attract somebody like Volkswagen or Ford company or General Electric to have their business in Ukraine. And this is very difficult because you have extremely uncertain environment, right? So in current conditions, it will be crazy to invest in Ukraine because you can build a factory there, but the next day it may be destroyed by Russian missiles, right? So this is going to be very difficult. But what you can do, you can rely on some type of government intervention where you de-risk investment in Ukraine. De-risk investment in Ukraine. For example, we have European Investment Bank that can be very helpful. It's a giant institution. It's bigger than World Bank. World Bank has insurance against military risk called MIGA that can be scaled up, okay, to stimulate investment in Ukraine. We have a BRD, a bank that was created after the collapse of the Soviet bloc to help transition economies reform themselves. We can do that. We can use this institution. Council of Europe Development Bank, CEB. This bank was created after World War II to help refugees get their housing, right? Maybe this institution is still there. Maybe this CEB is going to have second life going forward to help Ukraine. We can have all sorts of public-private partnerships to, again, de-risk investment and leverage public money to attract private money. This is going to be very important. Some of this is going to happen naturally because even the prospect of joining European Union is going to be a very powerful stimulus, right? If you have cheap workforce, you're very close this is a great incentive to put your business in Ukraine. I already mentioned that the war affected Ukraine very, very unevenly, and we will have to take a very hard look into what can be rebuilt and what cannot be rebuilt. For example, Kharkiv, this is the second largest city. It's really a cluster of universities. It's only 40 kilometers away from the Russian border. Every day it is attacked by Russian, missiles, shells, whatever. Today it was attacked 3 times, right? Now imagine, will you send your kids there to study? Obviously not, right? At least not now. But in the future, there is always this risk that, this city may be attacked again. And so you have to think very hard about the city. What do you do with this? Mariupol is here. It's completely destroyed. Like, do we need to rebuild the city? There are some fundamentals that may say, well, we have to do something there because it's profitable. It makes sense. But many cities in eastern Ukraine were basically centered on a coal mine or some steel mill that is not economically efficient anymore. It's not viable. What is the future of these places? We don't know, but we have to be very careful with our scarce resources. Now, having said this, there are some projects there for sure that need to be financed, and they're going to be important not just for the economy, but also for strategic reasons. For example, here, this map here shows the railroad network of Ukraine. And it's kind of hard to see here, but if you add Russia here in the north, you will see that all railroads are going north-south. They go towards Moscow. It's a Moscow-centric network. And it kind of makes sense if you're a part of the Russian Empire. But Ukraine is hopefully not going to be a part of Russian Empire going forward. And instead, north-south, it needs east-west connections. So for example, it needs a connection here. It's very clear. Also, the gauge of railroads in Ukraine is different from Europe. So we have to change the gauge. It's going to cost a lot of money, anywhere between $50 and $130 billion. It's not per year. It's cumulatively over maybe 10, 15 years. But that's going to be very important because if you ship goods from Ukraine to Europe, you don't have to spend a lot of time and resources here when you have to change trains. This is extremely expensive. We can reduce this cost. Also, it's important for national security because what we see now is that Russians are using Ukrainian railroads to move around their troops. We don't want this again, right? So we want to make sure they cannot use our infrastructure to attack Ukraine again. Now, I already mentioned this, but to emphasize this point one more time, the reconstruction of Ukraine is not just about rebuilding bridges, schools, and so on. It's also about changing institutions. And the general idea here is that you don't have to wait until the end of the war to reform those institutions. You can have changes in your courts, in your parliament, in the government, and corporate governance, even now. Right, so you can pass laws, change regulations, have selection committees, get the process going. Because at some point, when hopefully Ukraine is going to receive a lot of reconstruction aid, we have to have infrastructure ready and credibility that this money is going to be well spent. Because ultimately, we are going to be responsible in Ukraine for to taxpayers in so many different places. We want to convey that this is well spent money. Another point, I already mentioned this, that Ukraine experienced a giant relocation shock. But, frankly, a lot of this relocation was already underway even before the war started. Even before Russian annexation, it was clear that Eastern Ukraine is sort of a rust belt in Ukraine, and it is going to die, or at least it's going to be depressed for a long time. And so naturally, capital and people started to migrate to other places in Ukraine, to central Ukraine, to Western Ukraine. The war accelerated this trend, and we have to help this relocation to happen as fast as possible. What does this mean? It means a lot of retraining and reintegration. We have different people with different skills. Suppose you work in a steel mill somewhere in Eastern Ukraine, you come to Western Ukraine, to Lviv, there is no steel mill there. What do? We have to find a new place for you. We have to retrain you. This also means that we have to have more deregulation. I think for anybody who wanted to rebuild anything in Berkeley or Oakland, it's clear that it takes a long time to get permits and stuff. In Ukraine, it's kind of similar. It takes a long time. Now, maybe it's okay for peaceful days, but it is not okay for wartime, and definitely not after the war is over when we have to have a lot of new construction. I also mentioned that 9 million people left the country. We'll see how many are going to return. Survey evidence appears to suggest that 85% of people will return to Ukraine as soon as the war is over. But we'll see if this is going to materialize. And if it doesn't happen, you have to really utilize effectively your scarce resources in terms of labor. You have to attract women, youth, retirees, anybody who can be useful should participate in the reconstruction of Ukraine. I mentioned human capital as a key force, and it's very clear that if Ukraine wants to be a successful country, it has to invest more in education and research and development. And unfortunately, Ukraine was fallen behind in this dimension. It used to commit roughly 1% of GDP in R&D. It's much less than now, and it's fallen behind Bulgaria and other countries in the region. Now, there are some specific proposals how we can do this, but it's all centered on using the resources effectively. For example, Ukraine has many more universities that it will probably need in the near future. We have a demographic crisis. We're not going to have many students. We have to consolidate this, combine resources, use economies of scale to effectively use this resource. The same with healthcare. Have lots of hospitals which focus on the number of hospital beds instead of delivering quality care. That has to change. We will have lots and lots of people who are, traumatized by the war. You don't have a limb, you have anyway, all sorts of problems from the war. We have to include these people somehow in economic activity. We have to invest in education. Another thing, the last thing I wanted to mention here is that, we often portray Ukraine, help to Ukraine as an act of charity. And obviously it is an act of charity. It's very important to show support, show solidarity. But we should also think about Ukraine as an enormous opportunity going forward. For example, this figure here shows Ukrainian exports, over time. Traditionally, Ukraine was very heavy in metals, but it became a world power in terms of agricultural exports. And, it became very clear in the early months of the war when many countries in Africa and Asia basically faced the prospect of hunger. Now, this is still small relative to the potential. Productivity in the agricultural sector is roughly a third of what you have in advanced economy. So you can radically increase this. And then you don't have to worry about food security in various places. And it means, for example, that you don't have to have giant migration crisis in the Mediterranean region. Many people don't know, but number one export from Ukraine to the United States is not grain, it's not steel, it's IT services. And that's very important because Europe for many, many years struggled to develop its own Silicon Valley. You look at the list of big IT companies, none of them is in Europe. They're all American. Maybe, Asian and, Korean or Japanese. Now, it doesn't have to be Wild West to develop this, Silicon Valley. Maybe it's going to be Wild East. And Ukraine has been doing, dramatic progress there. Even during this war, this industry was growing at double digits. Friendshoring, again, this is mostly for Europe, but some of this is relevant for the US as well. The main idea here is that many businesses realize that, look, what happened to us in Russia can happen to us in China, right? So you make this massive investment and one day the government may say, well, it's not your property anymore, and that's going to be a huge loss. And so businesses try to relocate their production facilities to friendlier countries. And in this respect, again, Ukraine can offer a lot. For example, think about this in following terms. You buy something on Amazon, you click a button, and then within 24 hours, it's going to be at your doorstep. Very effective. We have this customer-driven economy. Now, if you want to ship something from China to, say, Hamburg, it's going to take at least a week, more likely like a month. On the other hand, if you put a container on a truck in Kiev and send this to Berlin or Hamburg, it's going to be there in less than 24 hours. So in this just-in-time economy, geographic proximity is extremely important. And certainly Ukraine is going to be a lot friendlier than Russia or China or any other really problematic country. So this can be an enormous opportunity. Now, let me conclude this by saying that when you see the images of Ukrainian cities, you wonder if these places are ever going to recover, if life is going to return to these places. It is really very, very sad. But frankly, we have seen something like this before. This is Köln after World War II, total destruction, complete annihilation. The only place which is relatively intact is this cathedral. And you would think that the city is dead. But, fast forward, and then you see Köln now, it's a very lively city, very friendly city, a very nice place to live. And so if we can do this to Köln, right, this transition, we should be able to have a recovery here in Mariupol. Now, let me conclude by saying that, I know this is a big book, 450 pages, it's 14 chapters, but if you can't fall asleep and you want to read something, it's a very easy read. 1 chapter per day, and you'll be done in 2 weeks. So I think it's going to be very useful use of your time. And if you have even more time, we have even more reports on various aspects of reconstruction, wartime economy, and what should happen in Ukraine after the war is over. Let me stop here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuriy. That was just very rich in information and suggestions and perspectives on what's happening and what may happen in the future. So thank you again.
Thank you.